Sonic X Comic Issue 39. Mr. Stewart ushers the kids into the shelters because Vector's been turned into a monster. In Sonic F, I found this guy a lot more interesting, because they really played up what a creepy villain he was from being overly sadistic towards Chris, calling him the red-shirted boy, calling him a visual aid, for no real reason at all. He even had a catchphrase, and the screen turned black and white while he said it with creepy piano music. In the comic, he doesn't have a personality. I look at Vector roaring as a giant and immediately get reminded of the story by Dan Slott, where in an alternate universe, so that was interesting right away, the Freedom Fighters and Chaotix and Sonic's parental figures were turned into Godzillas, and they had horrible designs, which was the big problem that made the issue off-putting. But when I ignore that totally superficial complaint, the story was much better than this. For one, the fact that they bothered to give the Godzillas different designs instead of just being giant versions of themselves proves that they weren't completely and utterly lazy. In fact, Fleetway, when Vector was turned into a giant, he had a different design and he was a monster. But more importantly, it took place in an alternate Mobius, so we got to see an intriguing new zone where Eggman was a good guy who was the mayor of a human city, and he turned the heroes into Godzilla by complete accident. It was a second good version of Robotnik. And he apologized to Sonic for Eggman being evil, and he worked with him to have him power a giant mecha with a treadmill he was running on. All of that sounds pretty creative and intriguing. So I'm willing to bet this story won't be that, because it takes place on Earth in an episodic comic with no guts. Vector actually has dialogue, saying he feels funny. Well, that's new. But he just roared. Why would he feel the need to roar and storm into a city to panic and possibly kill people if he still has the same brain? Espio says out of nowhere that he's got a ninja remedy that could magically cure Vector. This is why I hate Ian Flynn! I feel guilty about ragging on him all the time because I probably don't sound sympathetic, but I can't help it when he's always so lazy and disappointing. He immediately proved me right when I was hoping he wouldn't. I assumed that this would be taken more seriously than this. Why would Espio ever be able to cure a scientifically engineered futuristic mutanogen that was just invented? An ancient ninja remedy that probably doesn't have magic in it. And in the second bullshit lazy writing, the heroes wonder if it's a good idea to leave Charmy to guard the scientists, and the predictable humor happens because Charmy gets distracted extremely easily by the look over there trick, all so that the bad guys could get away. There's nothing scary about just having the villain punch him. It's not that hard. What, would he have gotten in trouble for writing it? How pathetic. Archie used to be so much more badass than this. Bunny threw Robotnik around and punched him in the face. And Charmy's a pretty hated character. This is awful. Two Deus Ex Machinas for a hero and a villain in a row. There's no logic at all. How is this written any better than Dan Slott's story, where everything that mattered made sense? It made sense that an alternate version of Eggman would be good, and Sonic would help him save the day by running a treadmill to power a giant mecha with a super speed. Which was already more logical than when Bowlers had Sonic power a mecha with super speed, where he did it by pedaling, with Sally, who had no super speed at all, and he kept powering it even when he was being forced to by a machine. And Fleetway's story was much better than this, because, at least, well, I don't exactly remember why Vector stopped being a giant, but I think it was because it was on a time limit, and he just turned back to normal automatically. Either that or he got knocked out by the military. Well, it wasn't memorable how he was defeated, but it's better than a Deus Ex Machina coming out of nowhere. At least there's one good moment, because when Eggman storms back into his base, his robot asks how his fight with Sonic went, when he's clearly got soot on him. Although, well, him having soot wouldn't exactly explain the exact details of how Sonic defeated him. Maybe that's what they want to know. But Eggman seems to assume that he's just asking, did you win or not? As all he does is say, yes, being a deadpan snarker for a change. The gold robot says that if it makes him feel any better, a monster is ravaging a station square, and Eggman says serves them right. But even that panel is stupid. Why would he and Eggman not instantly recognize that as Vector, instead of just calling him a monster? I gave the comic the benefit of the doubt and assumed that Eggman would realize his Vector in the next panel because he's smarter than stupid robots. Of course not. He just calls Vector a beast. You know, if he was written well and being smart, like a genius would be, he would get the idea to try to copy their plan and turn more of Sonic's friends into giants. I do like that he says that if someone stopped that beast, the citizens would throw themselves at their feet. That's something I love about Eggman in this comic. He's all about wanting praise and respect, whether that makes him the hero or the villain. He'll do a heroic thing if it gets him what he wants. This is how Scourge should be written. And it makes perfect sense. Like, hey, that's a potential great thing about having villains other than Eggman. It can motivate Eggman to be a hero for once because he wants the civilians to respect him and praise him. So he stops the villain. And also because I'm the only villain around here. It spices things up. Espio says that Vector's still growing. And Vector spits out a plane and says, sorry. Okay, so I guess the only reason he was walking around the city was... No, that doesn't make sense either, because just walking around would still panic and threaten people. If he was able to think clearly, he'd just stay still, not take forever to try to run out of the city. I think he lives in the middle of downtown Station Square. So my first theory was he was trying to get out of a populated area. But again, that endangered people too, so it's gotta be the mutagen brainwashing him and forcing him to walk. But not brainwashing him enough that he chomps down on the plane. It brainwashes him enough to make him roar, but not enough that he doesn't apologize. This is a prime example of Flynn's convoluted writing. Flateway, he was just made a giant and a monster, and that was it. It was simple. Same goes for Dan Slott's story. It brainwashes him enough to make him walk ahead. Oh, never mind. Not even that's true, because Sonic is able to tell him to not move until Espio comes back. Then why didn't he just stay still in the first place? This is getting me just as mad as Pender's James Bond parody, which is the only story of his I can always easily remember as really pissing me off because of a lack of logic. And this is just as bad. No, it's worse. Because the James Bond parody had huge variety in what the bad guys were doing. So it felt creative. There was more action as a result. There was a mystery behind who was the mole. And the bad guys weren't just Robotnik. They were also the SSS squad from AOCH. Vector is not stupid enough that he'd need Sonic to tell him to stay still when he's turned into a giant. Really, idiot balls are just a constant theme with Flynn. What's the fucking point of making a mutagen if it's not going to force someone against their will to act like a dangerous monster? The Crimson Cobra was so much more competent. Naruto wanted to turn Sonic into that, but Sonic would have just stayed still. It turns out that Bokoon is going to attack Vector, and that's what'll force him to defend himself and therefore risk collateral damage. Except I'm sure it won't be acknowledged that anybody died or got hurt no matter what Vector does, because fuck consequences. We need to have kids think that they can get away with anything. That's what good action series do. I did actually giggle at Eggman's line here because it was so obvious about it. Once your beloved city is rescued, you will have me to thank. Praise me! That's the first time I laughed at this comic in the slightest. And it's all about trying to be lighthearted and comedic. And that's the first time I thought it was funny. Vector breathes fire breath at Eggman, and instead of Eggman getting hurt or killed, he jumps to avoid it while his Eggmobile tilts. Logically, this should send the Eggmobile to the floor and Eggman crashing down and getting hurt. But we won't get to see that because, like Vector damaging the buildings having consequences, that would be too dark and edgy and make actual sense. Don't write it then! At least it makes sense to have Vector forced to not stay still because he's being attacked. Vector tells Bokoon that they don't have to fight, and Bokoon taunts him into grabbing his hands. He gives Bokoon a noogie. Bokoon hits his head from his shoulders. Well, at least Bokoon is doing something. And Vector tries to drown Bokoon in the water, but it's perfectly okay this time because he's telling him to say uncle. At first I just saw that as a natural continuation of how they're fighting like children, but then it dawned on me how dark this was. So Bokoon is waterproof, but Deco and Boko aren't? Espio goes to the pharmacy to get some aspirin that can reduce inflammation and swelling. Sonic says that's not ancient, and Espio says the first uses of the compound have been traced to 5th century Greece BC. That better be historically accurate, or else that's misinformation. It probably is. Sonic says there weren't any ninjas in Greece, and as I expected, Espio isn't written to properly respond to the fact that he was called out on for his ridiculous dialogue earlier. The only reason Espio is written to say it was an ancient ninja remedy was for the sake of forcing this joke. That's not good comedy, because it's not natural. If you have to force it, it's not funny. Basic comedy rule 101. Granted, this was a twist, and it makes more sense for a modern pharmaceutical medicine to actually work than ancient medicine out of nowhere, which had a 100% failure rate and yet people still trusted it. And this is Earth, so no magic here. So Espio couldn't have gotten a magical ancient remedy from anywhere on Earth. Plus he was talking earlier as if the remedy would be from a place that his ancestors were familiar with, because it's a ninja remedy. And yet he's not from Earth anyways. But a magical ancient remedy would have made more sense than freaking aspirin curing this. What was he thinking? That people would accept the stupidest of writing just because he wrote it? That they just say comics in general suck and blame the comic? Instead of acknowledging that's a problem with him and he's not perfect? It's almost like the story was written by a bad fanfiction writer or something. Back on topic here, I apologize. Tails and Chuck could have made an invention to cure Vector and dumped it on him from a plane. And it would have made more sense than a stupid joke, because they're do-anything engineers. This isn't OSCH. We have well-established engineers. We don't need to make up a much stupider, much more convoluted Deus Ex Machina or character to fill their roles. Then some gunfighter planes show up to threaten Vector, much to Eggman's chagrin because he won't get hero worship that way. Vector challenges Bokoon to a thumb wrestling war, once again brilliantly taking advantage of how childish Bokoon is. Sonic throws the aspirin in Vector's mouth. It works instantly to act as a magic shrinking ray when that's not how medicine works, and we already saw a shrinking ray. Chuck could have made that with somebody's help just fine. We could have brought back that shrink ray guy as a Chekhov's gunman, but that would have been good writing. That would have been putting care and thought into things. How could aspirin cure a scientifically engineered mutagen? Bokoon looks really sad because he wanted to win for once. Sonic is surprisingly nice to him, saying, "Don't sweat it, big guy. There'll be other days." Maybe his paternal instincts act up around him because he's more of a kid. Some fighter planes make Bokoon run away, and fortunately he doesn't damage any buildings on the way, when I immediately imagined the worst case scenario with this, where the fighter plane's shots would send Bokoon toppling over, crushing buildings below him, killing the people inside. It's not just the writer's fault. The editors in these Sonic comics do not do their jobs. While it makes sense in universe that the heroes would want to teach Charmy about how to handle medicine properly, it still feels like it comes out of nowhere and it's just ripping off Sonic Says, with the heroes randomly giving the audience a lecture while Charmy only exists to be the one given the lecture to. It's almost as bad as when Cream lectured you about recycling out of nowhere during a chaos fight. I like that realistically Vector's office is in shambles because he grew giant in the middle of it. Good thing the Chaotix were able to run out of the building when he was growing before it crumbled on them and killed them. Again, if it was logical, it'd be too dark. It was sweet that Vector said he would call a pizza with Sonic. Bokoon looks all bruised and sad because of the army missiles hitting him. Is he indestructible, or practically that? Those missiles should have done a lot more than just bruises. If he's practically indestructible, why him and not an awesome, dangerous robot? That only exists for the sake of forcing him to stay a main character instead of being killed off like he logically would be when he's thrust into dangerous situations. Eggman should make all of his robots as indestructible as Bokoon and send nothing but them at Sonic. And the fact that he doesn't do that makes him look like an idiot. At least it made sense with scratching ground or falling apart. And I wondered why Eggman would ever bother repairing them, but it's better than them just being covered in soot. Eggman says that he'll get to work in a shrink ray, and I immediately think about how shrink ray would have explained Vector turning back to normal much better. Why didn't Flynn make that the case when he thought to make it the case for Bokoon? And why bother manufacturing a giant band-aid for a robot? Bokoon says I can't wait about going back to work. Why won't he just quit? I feel so bad for him. This issue is by Ian Flynn, and he solved the problem of Vector turning giant with nothing but disappointing Deus Ex Machinas. Aside from the dart's existence, everything about the story was forced. And you know what? Even the dart's existence was stupid. This is normal Earth. Why would normal Earth scientists that aren't Eggman be able to make a dart like that? Why would a mutagen that was made to make Sonic a monster who destroy a city and be hated for it, why would that mutagen let Vector keep his free will so he can stand still? Why did it let him decide that he didn't want to hurt people? And yet he still roared and walked around the city for the sake of forcing a Godzilla reference. Dan Slott wrote this kind of story a lot better. If you can't write the story without it being completely nonsensical from forced lightheartedness multiple times, don't write it at all. Flateway had that problem too. I refuse to believe that mere aspirin would turn Vector back to normal. While it is a twist, it's unexpected. Twists are not by definition brilliant writing. That's not what aspirin is for. It wouldn't work that well. And even then, with Vector's giant size, I think he'd need a huge dosage to get it working properly. How would they know his exact weight to get the dosage right? Have him stand on a giant scale that would take forever to make? It's such an overly convoluted way of bringing him back to normal that Flynn probably thought was the most brilliant thing ever because it wasn't expected, purely because it wasn't expected, when it wasn't expected for a reason. A shrink ray by Chuck and Pell would have made actual sense, and we didn't need Charmy to screw up at guarding these villains. I'm not a fan of how the Godzilla-fied heroes looked in Dan Slott's story, but at least the plot of that made actual sense. And it was creative and exciting, and had a sympathetic moment for Sonic where he was sad about fighting his friends. But this is just empty, lazy Deus Ex Machinas. I at least loved that when Bokoon turned giant to fight Vector, not only was he actually doing something, but Vector made sure they fought like children, probably to avoid more collateral damage by being too violent, but he never says that, so it comes out of nowhere for him. They fought like children to take advantage of Bokoon's childish personality more. And I felt bad for Bokoon at the end. And I liked that Eggman wanted to make people praise him after he saved the city. That's a clear personality trait of his, that he's arrogant. And he's so arrogant that he doesn't realize he doesn't deserve the praise and won't get it because he's too evil. But this issue was overall a disappointment. It's like only Flynn could take such an epic idea and waste it by resolving it in one issue in a ridiculous rush job. Again! What is it with this comic and doing that? It sure is a good thing nobody was injured and a grand total of 0 buildings were damaged with 2 Godzillas going around. This could have taken place outside of the city. What kind of sugared up Godzilla parody is that? What's the point? Them being in a populated area was great for creating tension because the citizens were in danger. And there would be basically no tension if it took place in a wide open field. But I don't think anyone reading this actually thought they would have the guts to have even a single citizen get injured or die. And that doesn't make any sense at all.